The wooden cane made a soft tapping sound against the marble floor as the old man shuffled toward the courtroom doors. Each step was slow and deliberate, weighted with the kind of careful caution only age and memories of battles long past can bring. Whispers floated behind him like shadows in the courtroom. "Look at Grandpa's walking stick. Probably older than Moses. This should be over quick." The opposing legal team exchanged amused glances, convinced they were about to witness another easy victory over a frail old plaintiff with nothing but fading memories. To them, Harold Brennan looked like every elderly man they'd defeated before, vulnerable, forgetful, armed with a story that time would bury. But what the smirks and snickers couldn't predict was that the cane he leaned on carried a secret, one that had been carefully hidden for 80 years. Inside its hollow core lay a document, yellowed but intact, signed by none other than the man who had planned D-Day itself. As the courtroom filled with doubt and mockery, Harold reached slowly for the cane's wooden handle. With steady hands, he unscrewed it, revealing the carefully preserved paper inside. The room fell silent, the laughter dying in their throats as the true weight of his presence settled over them. This was no ordinary walking stick. It was a testament to history, sacrifice, and proof that respect isn't given lightly. In less than 30 minutes, Harold Brennan would remind everyone exactly what respect really meant, and forever change the way they saw the man they had once dismissed as frail and forgotten. Welcome to the Veteran Voices, where we discover the extraordinary truth hidden behind ordinary appearances. Before we continue with this incredible story, tell us in the comments, from which city in the world are you watching this video today? Your support means everything to us, and if you believe stories about our forgotten heroes deserve to be told, please hit that subscribe button. We're building a community that understands true strength often walks quietly among us, and your engagement helps us share these powerful moments with the world. The Essex County Courthouse had seen its share of drama over the decades, but on this particular Tuesday morning in October, most people expected nothing more than a routine property dispute. The case involved Harold Brennan, an 89-year-old resident of Millfield, versus Apex Development Corporation, which claimed ownership of the small plot of land where Harold's modest home had stood for 63 years. The facts, according to Apex's legal team, were straightforward. Their client had purchased the land at a tax auction after the previous owner failed to pay property taxes. Harold Brennan was simply a tenant who had never held legal title, and his claims of ownership were based on confusion and faded paperwork that proved nothing in a court of law. Harold arrived early, as was his habit from 7 decades of military discipline that civilian life had never quite erased. He wore his best suit, a navy blue wool that had fit better 30 pounds ago, pressed with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to his dress uniform. The wooden cane in his right hand was nothing special to look at, just weathered oak with brass fittings that had darkened with age. Most people assumed it was something he'd picked up at a medical supply store, a concession to time and arthritis. They would have been wrong on both counts. The cane had been with Harold since 1945, crafted by a German woodworker in a displaced persons camp outside Munich. The man had been grateful for the cigarettes and chocolate Harold had shared, and he'd put his considerable skill into creating something beautiful from the chaos surrounding them. What Harold had never told anyone, what he'd kept secret for 8 decades, was what he'd hidden inside that cane before shipping out for home. The courtroom filled slowly with the usual cast of characters. Apex Development had brought 3 attorneys, each carrying briefcases that probably cost more than Harold's monthly Social Security check. Their leader, Marcus Webb, was known throughout the county for his aggressive tactics in land acquisition cases. He specialized in finding legal technicalities that could strip property rights from elderly owners who couldn't afford to fight back. Webb had reviewed Harold's case with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a patient who wouldn't survive the operation. The old man claimed his father had purchased the land in 1922, but the deed had been lost in a house fire decades ago. All Harold had were tax receipts, utility bills, and the kind of documentary evidence that established residency but not ownership. In Webb's experience, cases like this ended with tearful elderly defendants signing settlement agreements for a fraction of their property's value. Behind Harold, the gallery filled with curious locals who'd heard about the case through the small-town network of coffee shops and church bulletins. Most were retirees themselves, people who understood that losing your home at 89 meant more than just a change of address. But even among his supporters, there was an undercurrent of pessimism. They'd seen this before, corporate lawyers destroying elderly residents with superior resources and legal expertise. Judge Catherine Morris entered at exactly 9 o'clock, her black robes flowing as she took the bench. She'd presided over dozens of similar cases, and while she sympathized with elderly defendants, the law was clear about property rights and documentation. Good intentions and long residency didn't override legal title, no matter how heartbreaking the circumstances. Harold rose when the bailiff announced the judge's entrance, his movement slow but steady, the wooden cane bearing his weight as he showed the same respect for authority he'd learned as a young soldier. Around him, people whispered about his age, his obvious frailty, the likelihood that this would be over quickly. What they didn't know was that Harold Brennan had stood at attention before generals and kings, had briefed Winston Churchill on battlefield conditions, and had carried secrets that helped win the most important war in human history. The cane that supported his weight had traveled across Europe, through the ruins of Berlin, and home to a grateful nation that had slowly forgotten what men like him had sacrificed. But today, in a courtroom filled with people who saw only an old man with a walking stick, Harold was about to remind them that appearances could be deceiving in ways they'd never imagined. The court will hear case number CV 2024-341, Brennan versus Apex Development Corporation. Judge Morris announced, settling behind the bench with practiced efficiency. Marcus Webb rose with theatrical confidence, his expensive suit and polished shoes announcing his presence before he spoke. Your Honor, Marcus Webb representing Apex Development Corporation. We're joined today by Associates Richardson and Park. He gestured toward his team like a general introducing his staff officers, each nod calculated to emphasize their numerical advantage. Harold struggled to his feet, the wooden cane creaking slightly under his weight. Harold Brennan, representing myself, Your Honor. His voice carried the tremor of age, but also something deeper, a quality that made Judge Morris look at him more carefully than she might have otherwise. The contrast was stark enough to draw murmurs from the gallery. On one side, a fortress of legal expertise backed by corporate resources. On the other, an elderly man with a cane and a cardboard box containing what appeared to be decades of accumulated paperwork. Webb wasted no time establishing his dominance. Your Honor, this case involves a clear matter of property law. Mr. Brennan has resided on the disputed property for many years, but residence doesn't equal ownership. Our client purchased this land at a legally conducted tax auction after the previous owner, not Mr. Brennan, failed to pay required property taxes. He produced a leather portfolio containing the auction documents, each page marked with official seals and stamps that looked impressive even from across the courtroom. The tax records clearly show that one William Morrison owned this property from 1920 until his death in 1961. After Mr. Morrison's death, taxes went unpaid for 3 consecutive years, resulting in the property's sale at public auction. Harold listened quietly, his weathered hands resting on the handle of his wooden cane. People in the gallery leaned forward, sensing the beginning of another David versus Goliath story where David had forgotten his sling. Mr. Brennan's claim, Webb continued with barely concealed amusement, is based on an alleged purchase by his father in 1922. However, he can produce no deed, no title insurance, no legal documentation of any kind. What he has are utility bills and tax receipts that prove only that he's been paying for services and taxes on property he never legally owned. A few people in the gallery actually chuckled. The situation seemed almost absurd. An elderly man claiming ownership of land based on paperwork that proved nothing while facing lawyers armed with official documents that proved everything. Judge Morris turned to Harold. Mr. Brennan, you'll have an opportunity to present your evidence. What documentation do you have supporting your ownership claim? Harold opened his cardboard box with the slow deliberation of age, removing stack after stack of papers that looked increasingly inadequate compared to Webb's professional presentation. There were yellow utility bills dating back to the 1960s, handwritten receipts for property tax payments, insurance policies for a house that had burned down in 1987, and dozens of other documents that told the story of a long life lived in one place. Your Honor, Harold said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. My father bought this land from William Morrison in 1922. We lost the deed when our house burned down, but I've been paying taxes on it for 63 years. I built my current house there in 1961, raised my children there, buried my wife from the church down the road. The words carried emotional weight, but Webb was ready with a legal scalpel that cut straight through sentiment. Your Honor, Mr. Brennan's own statement proves our case. He admits that William Morrison owned the property, and our records show Morrison retained ownership until his death. Any alleged sale to Mr. Brennan's father would have been recorded with the county, and no such record exists. Richardson, one of Webb's associates, leaned forward with documents that had clearly been prepared for this exact moment. Furthermore, Your Honor, we have affidavits from longtime residents stating that they always understood William Morrison to be the property owner, even after Mr. Brennan began living there. The affidavits looked official and damning. Harold's neighbors and friends, people who'd known him for decades, had apparently testified that they'd never considered him the legal owner of his own home. The betrayal showed in his face, though he tried to hide it behind the stoic expression that had served him through harder times than this. Someone in the gallery whispered, "Poor old guy doesn't have a chance." Another voice, slightly louder, "Should have gotten a lawyer instead of bringing that old cane." The comment drew a few more chuckles, the kind of nervous laughter that erupts when people watch something uncomfortable but inevitable. Harold heard it all, his grip tightening slightly on the worn brass handle of his walking stick. Webb sensed victory and pressed his advantage. Your Honor, we sympathize with Mr. Brennan's situation, but property law exists to protect legitimate ownership rights. Our client purchased this land through proper legal channels after due diligence showed no valid competing claims. Mr. Brennan's 63 years of residency, while admirable, doesn't constitute legal ownership. Judge Morris was flipping through Harold's documents, clearly struggling to find anything that would support his claim against such overwhelming legal evidence. The utility bills and tax receipts told a story of long residence, but Webb was right about property law. Paying bills and taxes didn't prove ownership without a deed or other legal documentation. Mr. Brennan, she said gently, I appreciate the emotional significance of this property to you, but I need to see evidence of legal ownership. Do you have anything beyond utility bills and tax receipts? Harold was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the courtroom walls. When he spoke, his voice carried a different quality, not the tremor of an old man pleading for mercy, but something harder, more certain. Your Honor, I need to tell you about my father and what he did during the war. Webb objected immediately. Your Honor, Mr. Brennan's war service, while admirable, isn't relevant to property ownership law. Not my war service, Harold said quietly. My father's. And it's more relevant than you might think. The courtroom grew quieter, sensing a shift in tone they couldn't quite identify. Harold's posture had changed slightly, his grip on the cane more purposeful than supportive. My father, Thomas Brennan, served in World War I. When he came home, he used his veteran's bonus to buy land from William Morrison in 1922. They shook hands on the deal, and Morrison gave him a deed that was supposed to be recorded with the county. But it wasn't recorded, Webb interjected. Which proves. It wasn't recorded, Harold continued, because William Morrison had a problem. He'd been selling the same piece of land to multiple buyers, taking their money and giving them deeds he never bothered to make legal. When the county investigated in 1923, they found Morrison had defrauded 17 different families. The gallery stirred with interest. This was new information, something that hadn't appeared in any of Webb's legal research. Morrison disappeared before he could be prosecuted, Harold continued. Left town with thousands of dollars in fraudulent land sales. The county tried to sort out the legal mess, but most of the victims couldn't afford lawyers. They lost their money and their claims. Judge Morris leaned forward. Mr. Brennan, do you have documentation supporting these allegations? Harold's weathered hand moved to the brass handle of his cane, fingers tracing the metal fittings with familiar precision. Your Honor, before I answer that, I need to tell you about my war service. Not because it's relevant to property law, but because it explains why I've kept certain documents safe for 80 years. Webb was growing impatient. Your Honor, we object to this extended narrative. Mr. Brennan's military service doesn't affect property ownership rights. But Judge Morris was studying Harold's face, recognizing something in his bearing that suggested there was more to this story than anyone had realized. "I'll allow it, but please be concise, Mr. Brennan." Harold nodded, his grip on the cane shifting slightly. "I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in 1943, assigned to intelligence work in England. My job was keeping track of enemy troop movements, analyzing captured documents, briefing senior officers on battlefield conditions." His voice was growing stronger, carrying echoes of authority that had been dormant for decades. "I worked directly with Supreme Allied Command, briefing General Eisenhower's staff on German defensive positions. After D-Day, I was part of the team that processed captured German documents, including records of war crimes and Holocaust activities." The courtroom was completely quiet now, the earlier whispers and chuckles forgotten as people realized they were hearing something significant. The work was classified, highly sensitive. "We dealt with documents that could change the course of the war if they fell into enemy hands. We learned to hide important papers, to keep them safe even when everything else was falling apart." Harold's hand was still resting on the cane's handle, but his posture had straightened in a way that made him appear taller, more commanding than the frail old man who'd entered the courtroom an hour earlier. "When I shipped home in 1945, I brought something with me. Something I've kept safe for 80 years, hidden where no one would think to look." The silence stretched taut as everyone waited to see where this was leading. Webb looked confused, his confidence beginning to crack as he realized this wasn't going the way he'd expected. Harold's fingers found a small catch on the brass handle of his cane, something so subtle that no one would notice it unless they knew exactly where to look. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I'd like to present evidence that I believe will resolve the ownership question." And with practiced precision, he unscrewed the handle of his wooden cane. The brass handle turned with the smooth precision of fine German craftsmanship, separating from the wooden shaft with barely a whisper of sound. Inside the hollow cavity, rolled tight and wrapped in oiled silk, was a document that had been waiting 80 years for this moment. The courtroom held its collective breath as Harold carefully extracted the bundle, his weathered fingers handling it with the reverence of someone unwrapping sacred relics. The oiled silk fell away to reveal papers that were yellow with age but perfectly preserved, their edges sharp and their text still clear despite 8 decades in darkness. Harold unrolled the first document slowly, and even from across the courtroom, people could see the official letterhead at the top. But it was Judge Morris who spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force." "My commission, Your Honor," Harold said, spreading the paper carefully on the defense table. "Signed by General Dwight D. Eisenhower on September 15, 1943. The gallery erupted in murmurs, but they were different now. Not mocking whispers, but sounds of awe and recognition. The feeble old man, with the funny walking stick, was holding a document signed by the Supreme Allied Commander, the man who had planned D-Day and accepted Germany's surrender. Webb was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, while this is certainly interesting from a historical perspective, military commissions don't affect property ownership rights." But Harold was already unrolling the second document, and this one made Webb's objection die in his throat. It was a deed, perfectly preserved and completely legal, showing the sale of the disputed property from William Morrison to Thomas Brennan, dated March 22, 1922. At the bottom, Morrison's signature was clear and unmistakable. "Your Honor," Harold said, his voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who had once briefed generals. "This is the deed my father received when he purchased the property. When we learned about Morrison's fraudulent activities, my father asked me to keep this safe. I was trained in document preservation during the war, and I knew how to protect important papers." Judge Morris was studying the deed with the intense focus of someone examining evidence that could reshape everything. "Mr. Brennan, this document appears authentic, but it would need verification." Harold was already unrolling a third paper. "Your Honor, this is a notarized affidavit from County Clerk Margaret Patterson, dated April 3, 1923. She certified that she personally witnessed the sale between Morrison and my father, and that the deed was valid despite Morrison's failure to file it properly. The affidavit was signed, sealed, and notarized with the kind of formal precision that characterized legal documents from an era when such things were done by hand. More importantly, it directly contradicted everything Webb had claimed about the property's ownership history. But Harold wasn't finished. From the same silk bundle came a fourth document that made the corporate lawyers look like they'd been struck by lightning. It was a letter from the Essex County Attorney's Office, dated 1924, acknowledging that Thomas Brennan was the rightful owner of the disputed property and apologizing for the confusion caused by Morrison's fraudulent activities. Your Honor, Harold continued, his transformation from frail elderly man to commanding officer now complete. I also have the complete investigative file on William Morrison's fraudulent land sales, including testimony from 16 other victims and Morrison's confession before he fled the county. He was producing documents like a magician pulling rabbits from a hat, each one more damaging to Apex's case than the last. Tax assessments from the 1920s showing Thomas Brennan as the property owner. Insurance policies dating to 1925. Even a letter from the local postmaster acknowledging the Brennan family's residence at the disputed address. Webb was frantically shuffling through his papers, looking for some legal argument that could overcome this documentary avalanche. His associates were whispering urgently, but their confidence had evaporated like morning mist. Furthermore, Harold said, unrolling what appeared to be the final document, I have William Morrison's signed confession, witnessed by 3 county officials, admitting to fraudulent land sales and specifically acknowledging Thomas Brennan's legitimate ownership of this property. The confession was devastating, a complete admission of guilt that destroyed any claim Apex might have had. Morrison had signed it before fleeing the county, probably hoping to avoid federal prosecution for mail fraud. Judge Morris was examining each document carefully, but even from her position on the bench, it was clear that Harold's evidence was authentic, comprehensive, and completely legitimate. The papers weren't just genuine. They were the kind of documentation that property lawyers dream about finding. Your Honor, Harold said quietly, I kept these documents safe because my father asked me to, and because my military training taught me that important papers need protection. I never thought I'd need them after all these years, but when Apex claimed ownership of my land, I knew it was time to reveal what I'd been protecting. The courtroom was completely silent as the implications sank in. Harold Brennan wasn't just a confused elderly man with faded memories. He was a World War II intelligence officer who had preserved documentation that proved his family's ownership beyond any legal doubt. Webb made one last desperate attempt. Your Honor, the age of these documents raises questions about their authenticity. We request forensic analysis. Mr. Webb, Judge Morris interrupted, her voice carrying a warning tone. Are you suggesting that a decorated World War II veteran forged military documents signed by General Eisenhower? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Webb's face reddened as he realized how his objection sounded, especially given the obvious authenticity of Harold's commission and the supporting military documentation. Harold carefully rolled his documents back into their protective silk, his movements precise and unhurried. Your Honor, I served under General Eisenhower when he planned the invasion that saved Europe from fascism. I've kept these papers safe for 80 years because they represent something important, the truth about who really owns this land. He looked directly at Webb and his corporate team. You came here thinking you could intimidate an old man with a walking stick. But this walking stick has carried more important documents than you'll see in your entire legal career. The silence that followed was profound, the kind that makes people examine their assumptions about appearances and reality. The man they dismissed as a confused elderly plaintiff had just produced documentation that would make legal historians weep with envy. Judge Morris straightened her papers and looked at both sides. Based on the evidence presented, I'm prepared to rule on this matter. The gaveling that followed was more formality than necessity. Judge Morris had reviewed Harold's documents with the thoroughness of someone who understood she was examining historical artifacts as well as legal evidence, and her verdict was as decisive as it was inevitable. In the matter of Brennan versus Apex Development Corporation, she announced, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, I find that the plaintiff has presented clear and compelling evidence of ownership dating back to 1922. The documents preserved by Mr. Brennan establish beyond any reasonable doubt that his father, Thomas Brennan, was the legitimate purchaser of the disputed property, and that the subsequent tax sale was invalid due to fraudulent activities by the original seller. Webb was already gathering his papers, his earlier confidence replaced by the hollow expression of someone who'd just lost a case he'd assumed was unwinnable. His associates were stuffing documents into briefcases with the hurried movements of people eager to escape an embarrassing defeat. Furthermore, Judge Morris continued, "I'm ordering Apex Development Corporation to cease all claims on the property and to pay Mr. Brennan's court costs and attorney's fees. I'm also referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential fraud in the tax sale proceedings." The gallery erupted in applause, but Harold remained seated, carefully returning his precious documents to their protective silk wrapping. The wooden cane lay across his lap, its secret revealed after 8 decades of patient waiting. As the courtroom emptied, people approached Harold with a mixture of awe and apology. The same neighbors who had provided affidavits against him now wanted to shake his hand and hear about his war service. The reporters who had come expecting a routine property dispute were frantically taking notes about a story that was far more significant than anyone had imagined. But Harold was focused on reassembling his cane, screwing the brass handle back into place with the same careful precision he'd used to disassemble it. The documents were safe again, protected inside their hollow sanctuary, ready to wait another 80 years if necessary. A young reporter approached him as he prepared to leave. "Mr. Brennan, why didn't you mention your military service earlier? Why keep those documents hidden for so long?" Harold leaned on his cane, considering the question with the thoughtfulness of someone who'd spent decades learning when to speak and when to remain silent. "Young lady, I learned a long time ago that the most important things are often the ones we don't talk about. My father taught me to keep these papers safe, and the Army taught me how to do it properly." He paused, looking around the courtroom where an hour earlier people had been laughing at his walking stick. Sometimes people need to learn respect the hard way. Today seemed like the right time for that lesson. As he walked toward the exit, the wooden cane tapping softly against the marble floor, Harold moved with a different bearing than when he'd entered. Not because his age had changed or his joints had improved, but because the weight of secrecy had been lifted from his shoulders. For 80 years, he'd carried the responsibility of protecting documents that proved his family's rightful ownership. Today, that responsibility had been fulfilled. Outside the courthouse, the October afternoon was crisp and clear, the kind of day that made him remember why he'd fought so hard to keep his home. The property that Apex had tried to steal wasn't just land and a house. It was the place where he'd returned from war, where he'd raised his children, where he'd buried his wife and planned to rest himself when the time came. The wooden cane that had supported him through this battle would continue supporting him through whatever battles remained. But now, instead of carrying the weight of hidden secrets, it carried the satisfaction of truth revealed and justice served. Harold Brennan drove home slowly, taking the long way through neighborhoods where people had heard about the court case and were beginning to understand that the quiet old man with the walking stick was someone far more significant than they'd ever imagined. Tomorrow, there would be newspaper articles and television interviews, history professors wanting to examine his documents, and military historians eager to hear his stories. But tonight, he would sit in his own house on his own land, secure in the knowledge that some things are worth protecting, and that respect, once lost, can sometimes be reclaimed by those patient enough to wait for the right moment. The cane rested against his kitchen table, looking like nothing more than an old man's walking stick. But Harold knew better. Inside its hollow core, wrapped in oiled silk and protected by German craftsmanship, lay documents that had changed history in a small way and proven that appearances, no matter how convincing, are often the furthest thing from the truth. Sometimes strength walks with a cane. Sometimes wisdom hides in plain sight. And sometimes, when mockery reaches its peak and defeat seems certain, the most unlikely heroes reveal that they've been carrying the power to change everything, waiting patiently for the moment when truth matters more than assumptions. The courtroom had laughed at his cane. But laughter, Harold had learned, often dies when people discover what they've been mocking was actually protecting something far more valuable than they could have imagined. Justice, preserved in a walking stick for 80 years, delivered when it was needed most. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who carried secrets and sacrifices in silence, waiting for the moment when their quiet strength would be revealed? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how they changed your understanding of what real heroism looks like. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, stories about ordinary people carrying extraordinary burdens with grace and dignity, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.